Hello. Bring it back over here. Thank you.
And we are lucky to have as our delegation Alan Boniface. Welcome, Alan, and thank you for agreeing to our invitation and meeting with us. It's very much appreciated. Over to you.
Okay, so this presentation was actually given to council and to a good chunk of the island, I think 4 or 5 years ago. So I've tried to condense it and I've tried to make it more relevant to today. But I can take half an hour, I can take 40 minutes, 45 minutes. That's sort of what I'm targeting. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And then if there's questions, I'd be happy to answer those, or we can have a discussion, I guess. I just briefly, when we did this work, our firm was called Hotzenbacher Boniface, architectural firm in Vancouver that's 40 years old, and we've since changed our name. So I just wanted to briefly, for those of you who don't know our firm, a couple of quick slides. We are the authors of Granville Island in Vancouver. We do work all around the world. This is a project in Los Angeles that we are doing master planning for in the downtown. We did the master plan for the Olympic Village in Vancouver, including a lot of the public space there. We did the CBC on Georgia Street. I'm trying to pick projects you'd know. So, and we very consciously made this into a public gathering place for better or worse. You see some blue jerseys. We do a lot of historic and heritage renovation. This is a project in the west end of Vancouver called Mall Hill. The City of Vancouver, Richmond City Hall, the Capers building on West 4th, which involved the entire block on West 4th, Lonsdale Quay in Vancouver. University at Simon Fraser University is a project that we've been working on for about 10 years. Incognito Desert Center in Osoyoos, which is a Governor General's Award-winning project, a very sensitive desert building. Quest University in Squamish, the entire campus and all the buildings. And there's many more, but I just wanted to make sure people have some context as to our firm. So just quickly, I threw this slide in here. This is what happened when we were asked to undertake some work on the island some years ago. And we, for those of you that are in the consultancy business, we probably spent 3 to 4 times our fee. We did a lot of work that came out of the heart of me being a resident on the island and some other people that really were passionate about the work that we did. So we interviewed almost 90% of the businesses and community groups on the island. We had our own public open houses because the government at the time here didn't want to have a lot of those, so we had our own, in addition to a couple that were held by the municipality. We had a land economist on our team that looked at some of the surplus lands and the other lands around the cove in terms of what they might be used for in the future and what was sort of highest and best economic use. We had a greenhouse gas study by the Camina Institute. We had landscape architects, traffic designers, architects and planners, and input from all the various committees at the time, including the Surplus Lands Committee. So it was a very extensive piece of work at the time. The document that was just held up is what I'm going to quickly, or reasonably quickly, walk you through. There's a lot of information in here. If there's something you don't understand, please stop me while I'm going through, because there is a heck of a lot of material to get through. So why did we do this? Well, originally the municipal government at the time was very interested in, I think, everything we're all interested in, the cove, ferry marshalling, but they also had, and surplus lands, but they also had a particular take on greenhouse gases and trying to understand how the island was working in a sense. So one of our studies, and that slide just disappeared, not sure why, was an affordability trend study, which looked at income on the island and housing prices. So this is a very important piece of information that basically showed that at the time, housing prices were beginning to far outpace the kind of average person, if you will, on the island, the average purchaser of a home or even renter of a home. And that was something that was pretty important to us at the time. When we looked at the cove, what we saw at the time was a lack of business activity in a sense, and that's continued to sort of decrease through time. The old bakery burnt down, it hasn't been replaced. And we also saw a trend at the time that many of the employees coming to the island actually came from off-island, which seemed kind of strange. It wasn't the first thing you'd anticipate when you looked at things. So those were some of the initial conditions that were important to us to try to say, look, if we can have more affordable and a wider variety of housing types on the island, then perhaps we could have a more cohesive community, one that has their employment and living together as opposed to having to have people from over here. And then we looked, there were many slides in the original presentation about CO2. We looked at all the businesses at the time. We interviewed everybody, all the owners as well. And what we decided was that we needed to really focus on the Cove as the focus of future development. That if we could change the nature of transportation on the island in the sense that if you had enough energy and activity in the Cove, you'd have a true village, and that maybe you would sort of decrease the amount of ferry trips, because as you all know, half of the island leaves the island every day. That's a pretty amazing statistic. Mm-hmm. So that was part of the placemaking idea behind the village. And a lot of our work around the world involves looking at places and trying to find ways to make a complete community. And what that means is there's employment opportunities, there's opportunity for recreation, there's ease to get to things, which usually means walking and biking. And Bowen doesn't really have a lot of those things. We get in our car to go visit our neighbors because of the way the road system is set up. So the study area, if this was bigger, it'd probably be easier to see, but the study area was essentially the core of Government Road, the intersection immediately above that with Dorman, and up to the school, and up to including Artisan Square and Dorman Point. So essentially it was the core, but with some of the adjacent lands around it. And what we began to look at is where were opportunities to, and this is, keep in mind, this is not something to do in the next 10 years necessarily. This was a 25-year plan so that we understood how to move forward on Bowen Island with something that was strategic as opposed to ad hoc. So what we began to do, the black circles were looking at lands that were either underutilized or with the topography might be available for future development. And then later we looked at what types of development might be available. This was not, as we were accused of at the time, some kind of developer-driven study to look at how to intensify things purely for profit or something. It was actually a very sensitive look, fitting between trees and landscape as to where things might go. It was a very simple look, really. This is actually, I don't want you to read all this because it's in the report, but this was the land economist summary of housing prices in Greater Vancouver, housing activity on the island, and the second arrow down basically says we would expect market interest for townhouses and low-rise apartments to be very strong. That's on Bowen Island. The most marketable sites will be those with waterfront view, easy access to the village center, and or easy walking access to the ferry terminal. So this is a land economist, Coriolis Consulting, that we've worked with throughout Vancouver, a very well-respected firm, and they felt there was the potential with the right ingredients for future development here of mixed income, mixed housing. This is a study that we did as well, looking at, so basically the two curves meet sometime down in the future, but the idea was to lessen the amount of car traffic and increase, and that's private vehicle traffic, and increase other modes, especially walking and biking if possible. We also, because pictures are worth 1,000 words, we wanted to look at other very small villages around the world in mountain settings and places. This was also a study to look at the community center site. And so we threw some images in. That would be a good precedent for around the school, for instance. Remembrance Day is a huge event on the island. It's one of the most important things to me personally, and I think it's a great example of how the community comes together. That was a precedent for us as well. low, small forms of housing, mixed use we looked at. Nothing was a tall building, but we certainly looked at different forms, architecture that might be representative of the place we're in, as opposed to foreign architecture that's brought in. We looked at different types of power consumption as well, streetscapes, just things that would inspire people to think about Bowen Island a little differently. And then on Bowen, there's actually what we considered a very unique vernacular, which is the way buildings, so this is an architect speaking obviously, so I look at things a little differently, but the way the buildings are placed on Bowen Island, especially in the Cove, but even up here at Artisan, is very unique. You don't find these passages in between buildings in downtown Vancouver, for instance. So there's a real character and quality that's unique on Bowen that we wanted to take advantage of and try to push forward into the development in the future. And it's something that I think makes us special, right? I mean, these kind of passages, when kids discover this, when visitors discover this, it's something that's pretty cool. And obviously, our pathways through the landscape are also something that's important. Sorry for those of you in the back of the room, I expected the slide to be bigger, but this was basically looking at the major issues at the time. This is 5 years ago or so. Housing issues on the island, environmental change, climate change, and having responses to those. And the responses and strategies we looked at in a broad sense were a sense of place, creating a diversity of housing, having a community that was efficient in the sense that it was more compact. That's the way the world is moving right now. Having sustainable transportation, which includes walking and biking, reducing greenhouse gases, and having a combined live, work, and play in one singular place. And some of the actions that came out of that were, I'll take you through some of the design ideas we had at the time, but looking at buildings as green buildings, looking at a pedestrian-oriented village in the Lower Cove, looking at mixed-use development so that Artisan Square is a very good example of housing, and so is Wolfgang's project as well, of having housing over retail or some other flexible use, which seems to make a lot of sense in this context. Having integrated land use so that we think about land very proactively as opposed to reactively, and renewable energy as well. And then the consultant that was involved in greenhouse gas studies for the island, they did a very exhaustive piece of research at the time, which I'm sure is still somewhere in this building. Yeah. It's in, there you go. It's in Allison's office. The upper right there shows you that as our strained road system and reliance on the ferry and being a commuter place largely, we're producing 11 tons of carbon per person. So this is the worst example in Canada and equivalent to the worst countries on the planet. So it was, as a longtime resident of the island, it was interesting to me because we all think of ourselves as very green. We live in the forest and we are organic food and, you know, all that kind of stuff. But the truth is we actually burn a ton of carbon to heat our homes and to move around. So this is something I thought at the time was important for us to consider. It's quite profound. So we looked at the context of having more, or at least a greater percentage of the people living in the Cove as opposed to developments that are all over the island. And in particular, we looked at scenarios. In that case, this was looking forward to 2010 of how much carbon we would produce per resident. And then we looked at the Cove in particular with the kind of development we were looking at, and we could reduce the amount of carbon on the whole island per person from 11 to 8 tons, which is represented in the upper right corner. And potentially an average villager could be producing about 1 ton per person if we did everything right over 25 years, which is kind of the global target for carbon. So these issues that I identified that we wanted to take particular focus on, we did, and in particular we looked at land use and a pedestrian-oriented development in the Cove. And in doing so, we thought it was important to actually create a boundary around the Cove that was a growth boundary. So in other words, in a 25-year span, assuming there was a reasonable amount of development, we would ensure that, and this doesn't mean there may not be developments at the Cape or something like that, but in terms of multifamily, mixed use, reasonably dense typologies, we would limit that to a very succinct area within the code. And that did a number of things for us. It allowed that to be a walkable place, a bikeable place. Potentially it allowed for the nature of the car to change within that boundary. So what might happen is that if you were going to certain services, you might park on the edge of the boundary and walk to the middle or take some other mode. And this isn't just a nice utopian vision, it's also embedded in the economics of the place. So if you look at the development of properties along Government Road, and you look at their zoning characteristics, unless somebody's changed this in the last few years that I've been aware of, there are very high parking requirements, which seems absurd to me because it's very restrictive to development for those properties. But if you took away the parking requirements from those properties and helped enable more development to take place on Government Road by moving the idea of the parking just a little ways away, then you would change the economics of those properties as well. We then looked at, within that growth boundary, where are the places we really want to protect? What are the sort of sacred places within that in terms of landscape, watersheds, historic places, places next to the waterfront, those sorts of things. And we identified in the lighter green there, those places we didn't think should ever have development for a number of reasons. And what we were left with is what we called fingers, mainly along the roadways and pedestrian ways around the cove. And that's essentially where we looked at the development opportunities. Transportation, I touched on why that was important. And this is the concept of having a kind of core access zone in that circle where you might limit the amount of car traffic, and then having a wider band around that, which was a transition zone of transportation. So for instance, if you weren't driving on the ferry, you would be requested to park outside of the cove and not congest the cove anymore. These will need to be blown up for sure, and perhaps we can do that at the end of my talk. But what's represented here is, in brown, is a number of pedestrian crossings. So we looked at a whole network of paths. Can we make it bigger?
Just thinking if we just pull it back. Yeah, just pull the table back.
Helps a bit anyway. Still a maze of brown. But again, the concept here, without going into too much detail, is that we actually mapped out through the various areas around the cove by walking them, where were the likely pathways that would enhance what we already have. Some of these are already existing pathways. For instance, so this is Government Road here, ferry terminal. We looked at, for instance, the pathway to the ballpark and how that extends through into the upland area here at the back of the park. And we ended up having that as the primary pedestrian crossing of Government Road that then circulated up the hill to the school and the community center. That became the primary pathway for people to travel, which was away from traffic, away from confrontation with vehicles, that sort of thing. And then all the other brown pathways were simply routes that we identified that could become an important network of moving around the cove. And some precedents of, at the time, we were looking at the water edge as well. Again, looking at carbon and infrastructure as well. So in our study, we actually looked at some of the potential alternate sources of energy on the island, including district energy, solar, ocean loop, things like that. Now these may sound bizarre, but the ocean loop is actually used by a home on Bowen right now, down the way, one of the larger homes on the island. To
one of my neighbors has one too.
Right, completely heat their home and cool it. In fact, I have a wind turbine on my house as well that provides about 25% of my power. So there's a lot of things on the island that can be done that aren't as crazy as they might sound, especially if we were to join together and pay for some of this infrastructure.
So, but the loop is really expensive, isn't it? Because you have to deal with DFO and provincial government.
Potentially, but
It costs more to deal with them than it does to actually build them.
Yeah, what we did with that, we talked to Rondi, and because Rondi's already messed with the cove from a water point of view, there was the opportunity to perhaps run that somewhere in the marina area, which I don't think DFO would have huge issues with.
It wasn't difficult for my neighbor to get.
No, it's not difficult. It's expensive. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, I know. So
Now,
Anyways.
are you talking about geothermal?
We were also talking about geothermal, but Ocean Loop is basically hydrothermal.
Okay.
Yeah, taking advantage of consistent temperatures in the ocean.
Right.